Hello everyone, today we talk about the 896 Battle of Boulgarophygon in Thrace, between the Bulgarians led by the prince Simeon I and the Byzantine commander Leo Katakalon. It was an overwhelming Bulgarian victory that now we're going to analyze a bit more in strategic background and consequences than else, because this battle video is not properly being a tactical history like the one that we used to do, simply because we don't know how the battle was fought, right? This is actually pretty frequent. Up to now we're kind of lucky to analyze battles mostly for what happened on the field, because we know that about this battle we essentially don't know much, which however is like welcome to the early or high Middle Ages if you prefer, and this is really the normality in many ways. It is, we know there were important battles that had great strategic significance, and that although we know nothing about from a strictly tactical point of view, right, we don't know what happened on the field. But this battle is equally interesting, however, because in fact of all the context that now we're gonna address. So, as we were saying before, this battle was fought in 896 in summer, during a good season, near the town of Boulgarophygon, modern Babeski, in Turkey, in the European side, and it was fought between these two very important powers at this point. The Byzantine Empire, definitely, that we don't need to present, and the First Bulgarian Empire was this medieval Bulgarian state that existed in southern Europe between the 7th and the 11th century. Was founded back in 681, according to tradition, by these Bulgar tribes led by Asparu that moved to the north eastern Balkans, and that where the Bulgars secured Byzantine recognition of their own right to settle south of the Danube, defeating the same Byzantines with their army led by Constantine IV, right? This happened possibly thanks to the help of the local South Slavic tribes that also were, eager to seize an opportunity to autonomize themselves from Byzantine rule. We have made some video about Slavic migrations. Maybe there is an entire playlist dedicated like to medieval Slavs in Eastern Europe. You can find something about that. And at the height of its power, Bulgaria spread from the Danube bend to Black Sea and from the Dnieper River to the Adriatic Sea. So it was kind of a big power that, as you know, would basically end in the 11th century at the hands of the same Byzantines, with the defeat inflicted to the Bulgarians by the Emperor Basil II. Is one of the greatest emperors of the Byzantine Empire, also one of the greatest commanders in fact in medieval history, and for which he also got the name of Bulgaroctonos. It is the slaughter of the Bulgars or Bulgarians. Here, when we say Bulgars now, we're talking about the originary people that settled into the Balkans, that gave birth to this empire. But over time, as you know, this ethnic element was absorbed also by into the local, essentially Slavicized territory, and in fact we talk at that point of Bulgarians rather than Bulgars, just like the modern people, in fact. And it's a very fascinating history now. We can't tell because we talk strictly about the battle, but it's also important to set this background. Now, what's very interesting about the war that led to the Battle of Boulgarophygon, and actually other battles were fought before it, as we will see, is this a very important trade context. Like, many people talk about this Bulgarian-Byzantine War of 894 to 896 that eventually brought with the annihilation of Byzantine army to peace, and also the establishment of a tribute to the Bulgarian Tsar by Constantinople, of a trade war proper, right? Because it's objectively, it seems that the main let's say it's very difficult to tell when a conflict starts, but let's say that one major factor that brought to this specific war between the Bulgarians and the Byzantines, aside from the various strategic, other strategic factors, was the control of the Bulgarian trade and exports by the Byzantines, right? At this point, Bulgaria was in fact rising, pretty and flourishing actually from an economical point of view as a natural consequence of this stability that also the Bulgarian Empire had given to the region. This connection, in fact, to the Mediterranean and also Central Europe, right? Naturally, as most of, basically all of early medieval powers, the main wealth of the Bulgarian Empire came from agriculture, chiefly from cereals, but also, husbandry, livestock was something, especially considering that the Bulgars had come essentially as semi-nomadic peoples, that brought also, as it happened elsewhere with other semi-nomadic populations that settled down their own largely pastoral economy. So the Balkans were fit to sustain both of them, and there was definitely a direct link with Byzantine economy, because surely Bulgarian cereals and animals helped even to feed the Byzantine cities of the Aegean coast, and even more maybe also the Adriatic one, given that the Bulgarian Empire stretched for basically all into the hinterland, and to Constantinople itself, right? So there was also great importance given to other activities. Mining was one of them. Mines were worked, and their produce swelled the imperial revenues of the Bulgars. And what is very important, as we were saying before, is that the Bulgarian dominions at this point lay across the great trade routes, right? There is this big one. Has a very busy trade that passed between the steppes of Russia and Constantinople. So this basically Pontic, let's say Black Sea route that is very important at this time, also because with the loss of the Near East and North Africa at the hands of the Arabs, Constantinople had switched the markets, especially for grain imports from Egypt essentially and Syria to Crimea, right? So all the movements that were happening up there, that were essentially about this semi-nomadic or nomadic populations that settled into the Ukrainians in the Pontic steppe, were a big deal for Constantinople, that always sought to create a sort of balance of powers, and to not just for controlling, in fact, this trade, it was very important, but also for the same danger that some of these populations posed to Constantinople itself. Think of what happened with the Avars, for example, that had come from that direction, eventually settled into the Balkans and creating problem to Constantinople, and so on. This major Pontic route went, as a rule, by the sea along the western shore, in fact, of the Black Sea, but there was also surely some overland routes passing through Preslav, that was the capital of the Bulgarian Empire, and Adrianople, that was this major Thracian center of the Byzantine Empire close to Constantinople, very important in this sense, both from a military point of view, for controlling the Balkans, but also from a trade point of view. Preslav had been essentially a response to Constantinople from the Bulgarian side, meaning that obviously there is a difference of scaling here. Preslav never rose to become so important. Obviously, it was not possible to Constantinople. Preslav basically also doesn't exist anymore. I mean, it's like there are ruins of this Bulgarian settlement, but it was, however, a very important center at the time. And the idea is that the Bulgars had recently converted to Christianity. They had accepted, obviously, from the Orthodox rite, as this conversion had been directed by Constantinople. This is a phase in European history in which basically let's put it in this way, the Greeks and the Latins are clashing for the religious conquest of these various peoples of Central Europe that are still largely pagan. So it's a big deal whether they fit into the Orthodox sphere of Constantinople or the Roman Catholic one. And the Bulgars, for obvious reasons of proximity, share this Byzantine. They decide to absorb willingly this Byzantine influence, always given that it was largely formal in many ways, and it was mostly an elite process that was aimed at essentially being integrated as part of the same Byzantine Empire for sharing its benefits. Right, the same imperial title was conferred at one point to was recognized by Constantinople itself to the Bulgarian monarchs, and therefore it was like the Byzantines believed it was essentially creating a vassal state, kind of an imperial title, but that was naturally inferior to the Byzantine one. The Bulgarians instead believed that they were essentially peers of the Byzantines on that ground. And as we have said many times, even the building of these settlements was and of a central capital was a way of imitating these Mediterranean civilizations that were deeply rooted on cities and, in this sense, the ecclesiastical system, net of dioceses that were based on the cities themselves. So Preslav was a symbol of, it was a bit of the response of the Bulgarians to Constantinople, and we're actually close. I think it's just 200 kilometers. They're not very, very far even geographically. Naturally, the Bulgarians were always this kind of they were this kind of looming threat on the Byzantine Empire in the first place. The center of power is dramatically close to Constantinople. Even this war of the 894 and 896 would prove that, as the Bulgarians came after, or maybe before, nobody knows actually, the victory at Boulgarophygon to raid, to pillage around into Byzantine territory up to Constantinople, if I remember correctly. And that's why also the Byzantines had tried to, cope with the Bulgarians in a kind of a soft way, like not wall against wall, but trying to, in fact, to absorb them, to make them share this. And the construction of an Orthodox church in the Bulgarian Empire had been partly, the represented the success also from the Byzantine side of this thing. And naturally the Bulgarians, and especially as now an empire proper with a monarchy, also largely benefited from, because otherwise these Simeon peoples did have a concept of leadership that however was strictly military and emergential. For the idea is that you follow a leader as long as you have to migrate, because you need obviously a unity of command, but then when you settle down everybody is free, right? So even instead the construction of an empire proper, so with a rule that is considered an emperor, and naturally here we can see all the various semantic shades, like what was really an emperor, right? A Bulgarian emperor was definitely a different thing, also culturally, ethnically, from a Byzantine one. There was a different idea of leadership attached in Bulgarian culture at that point in the Byzantine one, but it was also shared, and a center of power in Preslav that symbolized this preeminence of a ruling dynasty fundamentally over now not just the Bulgarian, the Bulgar people, and eventually this Bulgarian, let's say this chunk of essentially Slavicide population settled on the right bank of the Danube, but also in the surrounding areas, right? This idea that it was actually an empire that could stretch its power by controlling, sometimes nominally or sometimes more directly, of course, depending on, so there were swings in the process. Very large, telling the truth, areas of the Balkans, right? And the Bulgarian Empire was a big thing, is often overlooked also. And the fact that the Bulgars had managed to defeat the Byzantines and to settle on the right bank of the Danube, so from the technically, from within the imperial territory proper, shows the power, the might of these people at this point. There were other trade routes, not just from Preslav to Adrianople, but also through, for example, Dristra to Thessalonica. Thessalonica was the second most important city of the empire. It was basically the second and only true city of the empire in that sense, meaning that here in the Byzantine Empire, in the early Middle Ages, were certain important transformations. Obviously, there were other centers, but let's say those cities that truly lived on were naturally Constantinople, which was kind of a universe on its own that controlled all these lands, especially, really also in terms of property. Like the emperors controlled large areas, even building estates in their own kind of a private possessions in Crete. And Thessalonica was kind of the only city that could wish for kind of autonomous rule, and being kind of a sound urban center that could have its own autonomy from Constantinople, that instead was managing now to swallow all the various settlements around the empire in terms of their political and economical autonomy. There is also another very important route, though, that at this point in history is rising, and for which the Bulgarian Empire becomes very, very strategically important. That is the route from Central Europe, right? The one that enters the Balkans via the Danube, basically, Belgrade, and that arrives at Niš and has this other branch leading to Sardica, that is Sofia today, and then eventually Philippopolis in Thrace, and Adrianople and Constantinople, right? So the other, also these other branches arrived to Thessalonica in itself. So this route, multiple routes, one north to south as an axis, and then from west to east, right? That is increasing in importance because also, Constantinople is increasingly connected via land, via Danube actually, with Central Europe and with the empire. Let's say at this point the kind of Carolingian Empire was already ended, but it was still this now Central European powers of Frankish origin, like especially now the Eastern Frankish power that was becoming, would become important eventually in a few generations as the, let's say, the equivalent of the Roman Empire in the West, for which also the Byzantines marry into the Ottonian nobility. So and there are in fact connections and relations between the Bulgars and this other powers. This is important to bear in mind because at this point the Angers, that also figure in this context, as we will see, have still not settled into the Pannonian Basin. So basically the Bulgarians are still the connection between the, let's say, the post-Carolingian world and the Byzantine one in the terrestrial route, right? So they have this great power that also in fact inspires to expand into towards the Pannonian Basin, that eventually will be settled, as we see now, partly seemingly as a consequence of the same battle of Boulgarophygon, of the Hungars, or the Magyars if you prefer. That would change a lot, not just in Bulgarian history, but also in Slavic history as a whole, because it would basically split into the Slavic world that at this point was pretty continuous and potentially also capable of creating its own cohesion if it hadn't been for these other people who arrived there. Given that the Avar Khaganate had been destroyed by the Carolingians, so basically it was this big gap that was exploited, and there were definitely contacts, in fact, in the northwest between the Bulgars. There had been, like, between the Bulgars and the Carolingians also back in the day, the previous centuries. This we have concentrated on trade because we will see now that this was one of the most important aspects of one of the casus belli proper, right? Because all these trade routes meant a steady flow of merchandise passing through Bulgaria, and enriching on its way the Bulgarian traders, and also other communities. Like at this point, the Bulgarians had hosted several Greek and Armenian communities that were kind of more entrepreneurial than the local Slavic population, that also had this broader connection towards the Byzantine world as a whole. Right, and at this point, the Tsar Simeon of Bulgaria watched with care over his country's commercial welfare, especially early in his reign. He had intervened in its interests, set going a train of circumstance, which means naturally that Bulgaria was becoming stronger and an ever greater threat to the Byzantines, right? We talk, in fact, of Battle of Boulgarophygon because of many international relations in here. Also, the intervention, as we will see, of the Hungars that acted as Byzantine allies against the Bulgarians. But the Battle of Boulgarophygon at this point proved to be the first decisive victory of the young and ambitious Bulgarian ruler Simeon I, who would become famous for his successful campaigns later, also against the Magyars, the Serbs, and in fact would lead Bulgaria to its greatest territorial expansion ever, making it basically the most powerful state in contemporary Eastern and Southeast Europe, and opening to this what is considered the golden age of Bulgarian culture at that point, as his reign was also a period of unmatched cultural prosperity and kind of enlightenment for the time. It was deemed later in this fashion, and the main problem here is that with the Byzantines is that the Bulgarians were not just content to share to have obtained this imperial authority, but effectively they wanted to take it away from the Byzantines themselves. I mean, this was the ultimate goal, right? And there will be a lot to deepen this sense, and I hope I will make a video about this one day, between as we were saying before, the different conceptions of power, of leadership, from this side. This idea that, that there had to be, that there wasn't a universal empire that could be taken, could be absorbed. So this is not literally the struggle between, like, kind of the Bulgarians proper as a national element, or the Byzantines proper, excuse me, in their universe. And then it's really a fight at the top. It's like this elites trying to emulate the most powerful ones of the surrounding world, and trying to rise to their level, right? This was something that had going on forever, historically speaking, and we have, as you know, on Schwerpunkt, we talk really a lot, on how the Roman imperial model lived very strongly throughout all the early medieval times, and there was no fall of Rome, not even like in the West. The West was, during the early Middle Ages, was radically obsessed with the idea of imperial authority, and the local Romano-Germanic powers were trying to recover that in any way they could, in many ways. Here, obviously, with the Bulgars, it was even more evident, given that they were so close, in fact, to seize Constantinople proper. So the point is that Simeon of Bulgaria would go on to inflict a number of defeats on the Byzantines in pursuit of the ultimate goal, which was seizing the throne in Constantinople, right? Which obviously didn't happen, because we know it, but it was an option theoretically, and could happen. So eventually, as we will see also after the end of this war, the peace treaty that was signed had resulted into this confirmation of the Bulgarian domination in the Balkans, right? So it was a way also to assert a power over another one that was deemed to be the universal one, the stronger one, the greater one, that instead recognized now a sort of of a necessary coexistence with an external competitor, at least. So during the rule of the Tsar Boris I, that was was rule of the First Bulgarian Empire, in between 852 and 889, the one had actually been baptized in 864, that after his godfather Michael was nonetheless the Byzantine Emperor Michael III, right? So it's a very important figure, also in here deeply overlooked, and he was the father of Tsar Simeon of Bulgaria. And in Bulgaria, under the rule of Boris I, underwent some major changes, right? First of all, as we've said, the Christianization of the country, which is not a small thing. It's a big political, institutional, cultural step for these populations. Also the admission of the disciples of Saint Cyril and Methodius, as you know, that are the two Byzantine Christian brothers and theologians that and missionaries that worked for the evangelization of the Slavs, and they're known in fact as the apostles of the Slavs. Well, these factors marked the beginning of the creation and consolidation, even of not just of the Bulgarian Empire, but also of Bulgarian culture in terms of literature and alphabet, for example. So we also start getting, we start knowing more about Bulgaria in the first place. So it's a way, definitely, it was in many ways artificial, especially at beginning in here, like as we were saying before about Preslav. And these models were imitated from the Byzantines, were very new models from the Bulgarians. In many ways, they didn't work completely as those rulers had hoped, but that definitely they contributed to give us stability to their authority and to produce sources and iconography, etc. So it's very important for us. I mean, they wouldn't obviously reach the Byzantines in at their level, but they still were dramatically important for the history of the Balkans and Europe during the Middle Ages. And Boris I is actually, however, recorded for not having been a kind of a brilliant military commander. I mean, at least there was a number of military setbacks against most neighboring countries. Yet you must give that Boris had managed to preserve Bulgarian territorial integrity in spite of all these defeats. This is important. This time in history, getting a defeat is really no joke. Like early medieval times, do not have a lot of options out there. You know, after a defeat, it's dramatically difficult to recover. Because the surplus given by crop rates is dramatically low, and therefore the capacity of the Bulgarian state to remain compact and living on it really speaks for its solidity, for its steadiness, and reveals naturally a deeper structuration this power and its roots also at a local level that also are very, very, very important, because it was partly the local populations that at that point were kind of also aiding this process. Like the Bulgars hadn't been, the terrible conquerors that had arrived spreading terror and enslaving and so on. It was definitely a dialogue in terms of the Bulgar chieftains and the local Slavic and or Slavicized elites in order to to achieve something larger, more civil, and that could in fact carve its own space as a political power, and detaching itself from the direct Byzantine rule. This is very important. In many ways, you can see, especially in Bulgarian case, this ability of riding the wave of the Slavicization of the Balkan Peninsula. Right, the Slavs had basically not come as during their migrations as confederations of warlike confederations of peoples that conquered and started immediately kind of monarchic rules. The Slavic migrations, in spite of their differentiation that obviously existed from place to place, were very, very capillary, and they had come in relatively small groups, and they had pretty, they were pretty intensive. They had managed effectively to change the ethnic fabric of the local territories, but they hadn't had a real guide. So in many ways, these populations arriving from the Eurasian steppes gave the possibility of this Slavic settlers to opt for a different rule than the one that within which the Byzantine borders they had necessarily had to accept and to develop basically as a power on their own. So and as we were saying before, there is a demographic process that involves the fact that the local population was on a regular base much larger than the one of the conquerors, so that in fact modern Bulgaria speaks Slav, right? So they doesn't speak kind of other tongues. So it's obvious that there was a very important element in the Slavicization also of these monarchies at the end of the day, that had contributed to the existence of these monarchies in the first place. And also there is always to realize that one thing is kind of raiding into enemy territory, one thing is to leaving one land to settle into another, and if you plan to settle in one place, you can't come to destroy or to impose your rule with iron fist, especially if you have this kind of very low, relatively low at least, demographic strength. You have to come to terms with certain dynamics, and there is in fact a civilization path to this. It's not to be given for granted, of course, but it's also logical, right? So we should also in many ways rethink, or at least reapproach maybe this phase of migration era that indeed in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe lasted longer than in the West, and that sees in fact this very fairly agitated and troubled world where stability was not really a chimera, but in many areas it was you really didn't know what would come next. I mean, ask even the same Byzantines that were taking one avalanche of peoples one after the other, trying to struggle for survival. It was evidently, however, a reason of opportunities as well, meaning that at the end of the day, the empire was a pole of attraction. See it as you like, but even in a conflictual perspective, still all these populations came to gravitate around some empire. Right, it happened also for the Western Empire. It happened because obviously wherever there is power to share, there is a niche where you can fit in and to obtain something from it in the virtue of your power, and there is also this internal interest from the side of the elites to come to imitate this more highly stratified civilizations in Europe that allow, in fact, the aristocracies to rule over the freemen, which normally in the steppes it wasn't the case. So it's a bittersweet relation also with these empires. It's never full friendship, but it's also never full enmity. And in the middle you find the development of very interesting realities that were also conceptually non-existing before, right? During the Council of Preslav in 893, assembled after the unsuccessful attempt of Boris I, eldest son Vladimir Razait, to restore paganism, which was an issue at this point, it was decided that old Bulgarian had to replace Greek as a language of the church, and that the Byzantine clergy was to be banished and replaced with the Bulgarians. So this was a very important precedent also with the relation with Constantinople. Here we see basically a compromise occurring at the Council of Preslav. From one side you have this push to restore, here it's paganism, but meant really as something deeper, right? Always remember, we discussed it a lot in Schwerpunkt, that this is not really a matter of religion, strictly speaking. Paganism, in reality, doesn't quite stand a chance towards Christianity in terms of models of civilization and of social, political and social direction. So it's not really the ideology that is a risk. Like paganism can easily coexist with Christianity. It happened all over the place. It's just a modern myth that basically monotheism and paganism are irreconcilable. Just it takes to study, in fact, the history of Northern and Eastern Europe. We made several videos about that. The real problem here is not religious. It's really political, and largely political and social, of course, as a reflection. And it's more about, who should rule and through which tools, basically. As we just finished to say, basically there is this obvious intent from the side of the monarchy, right, to remain a monarchy, not a shared authority with all the various oligarchs of Bulgaria, right? It's that was how naturally part of power was actually exercised, because naturally, at this point, it's not that the emperor of Bulgaria has direct control all over these people. So it's obvious, a debate with the oligarchs that can move the army and can move their clienteles, etc. So it's just like that. Like even the Byzantine Empire, it's not that, there are different degrees of centralization. There are kind of very different things for early medieval standards, but still, that's the problem. You don't have the contemporary state in here. So obviously, there is a cost in the process of building a more centralized structure, and there is the traditionalist side that usually pushes more for paganism from a nominal point of view. It doesn't have literally anything to do with religion, simply for the fact because of that the fact that these oligarchs simply wanted to reach the same imperial power that the emperor, that the Tsar owned, right? So at that point they would have simply switched to the Christian party, the Christian faction, let's say, if once reached power. This happens literally, like I can't think even of a single example in history where it didn't happen like that. Like it was exclusively about this. Paganism equals in here power to the nobility. Doesn't mean literally, these people cared more or less about paganism than what the prince did, right? So the Council of Preslav managed to contain this traditionalist push, but at the same time it probably acknowledged that large parts of Bulgaria still wanted to to resist fundamentally this process of Romanization, and were telling to the prince that they didn't they wouldn't give up their political autonomy for a sort of absorption of the or share of the sharing of the imperial power with the Byzantines, right? So at this point, the Tsardom had necessarily had to accept the concerns of the nobility, and it basically broke with Constantinople at the religious level. So as we have read, Old Bulgarian replaces Greek as the language of the church. This is of extreme importance because obviously the Bulgarians didn't write. Hadn't been writing, and nor the Slavs, basically. So here there is an important transition that means that now the same people has to reinvent kind of its own identity on a written base, right? That has to deal now with different models that are evidently old Byzantine, right? These guys learned to do everything from the Byzantine source. but now they wanted to give it a more markedly national character, right? They wanted to affirm their own unicity within this imperial commonwealth, as you want to call it. So the refusal of Greek as the language of the church, that is Greek here is not really one language, one random language. Here Greek is the language of the empire proper, which means it's the universal language. It's the language of the Bible. It's the language of the universal empire. So by refusing it, you inherently refuse not much universalism in itself, but the fact that the Byzantines are the only depositories of this, and that the Bulgars basically can do the same and or better, right? And so also the banishment of the Byzantine clergy was a pretty eloquent move, and the ensuing replacement with Bulgarians. So the Council of Preslav also sealed Boris I's ambitions for cultural and religious independence, calming down the concerns among the nobility that feared too strong or any kind of strong Byzantine influence in the internal affairs of Bulgaria, right? The council also decided that Boris III's son, Simeon, born after the Christianization, in fact called Child of Peace, was to become the next prince of Bulgaria. One thing that I didn't quite explain well, and in this sense I also made a mistake about, is that at this point the Bulgarian Empire wasn't quite the Tsardom that we know later. Like, the Tsardom was effectively obtained by Simeon himself later on, in 913, if I'm not wrong, as a formal recognition from the same Byzantines, right? So at this point there was, a model of, the Bulgarians already conceived a model of imperial leadership and rule, meaning that, as we were saying before, this was this main dynasty, this main, actually not dynasty, but prince, we can say, who was entrusted with kind of a rule over the people as a military guide, and that definitely could extend the one of the people, the rule of the people over surrounding peoples that became subjects in this sense. So this was a typical mindset of the steppes. So it had in many ways really not much to envy to maybe to other imperial titles worldwide. I mean, here it would be very interesting to deepen the concept of it, meaning that what was really this rule based on in Bulgar culture, and how was it eventually developed in these years before the effective gain of this imperial title from the Byzantines, with the clear intention of creating a sort of Bulgarian Byzantine Empire, right? Well, this is kind of important, but in here, the fact that, for example, the Council of Preslav, that even that is by the way a very important event, because it was a cornerstone for the same Christianization of Bulgaria, and at the same time it was recognizing a rule, right? The fact that Boris' son was recognized as his heir is already a dynastic process, so it's something more than just the elective tradition of the Bulgars. It's something that evidently has already developed since the Bulgar settlement in the Balkans that had occurred much earlier. And it's also interesting, in fact, that at this point Simeon was called the Child of Peace, stressing the kind of pacific relations that had to and the general pacification function that this ruler had to embody, hopefully, in the future. And the idea of peace naturally here is bent to the idea also of rule. Like, also the Byzantine emperor obviously was considered it as the great pacifier, like the peacemaker of the world, this divine mission, basically, of creating, extending the harmony of the kingdom of heaven into the world through his justice, through his wisdom, and his piety, for his faith, for sure. So the Bulgars were assimilating in part this model as well. So these events were seen by the Byzantines with concern, right? They evidently had ruined the Byzantine hopes to exert influence over the newly Christianized country of Bulgaria. And Leo VI, Emperor Leo VI, who was Byzantine emperor from 886 to 912, was the second ruler of the Macedonian dynasty. It was also very famous person. He was very well led. This led to his epithet, the wise. The Byzantine Empire witnessed the renaissance of letters, etc. And yet, as we will see, there were several defeats during his reign as well, including the one against the Bulgars. So Emperor Leo VI had soon a chance to retaliate, and some members of the Byzantine court had an interest in moving the market of the Bulgarian goods from Constantinople to Thessalonica, right? This was an important move, which meant that the Bulgarian merchants would have to pay higher taxes, right? Basically, there were certain Byzantine merchants who had already obtained monopoly over the Bulgarian trade market in the Byzantine Empire, and basically switching this market to Thessalonica from Constantinople equated to exert a much more direct control over this market, to increase corruption, to make it kind of a more personal business. So actually the emperor was fine with this, given the damage that he wanted to obtain, to achieve on the Bulgars, on the Bulgarians. So this move affected not only private interests, but also the international commercial importance of Bulgaria, that had been regulated, by the way, with the Byzantine-Bulgarian Treaty of 716. There had been this agreement between Bulgaria and the Byzantine Empire, signed by the son of ruling Bulgarian Khan Tervel Kormezi and the Byzantine Emperor III. And the ousting of the merchants from Constantinople, which was a major destination of trade routes from all over Europe and Asia, as we have seen, was a very heavy blow for the Bulgarian economic interest. So the merchants complained to Simeon I, who in turn raised the issue with Leo VI, but the appeal was left unanswered. Right. So this was obviously a retaliation for the Council of Preslav. And there was no solution to this. Like, you want to be a church on your own, you want to build kind of a state on your own, fine. Now we block your trade. So it's pretty important, because it already tells you what kind of price was at stake here. The not just a trade matter, power, but also an entire vision of how politics and rule had to be effectively exercised in the Balkans and kind of beyond, because of this move naturally concerned, commercially speaking, many other nations. So Simeon was seeking at this point a pretext to declare war to the Byzantines and begin implementing his plans, launched an invasion of Byzantine Thrace, resulting in what has sometimes been called sort of first commercial war in Europe. That is kind of an exaggeration, but it gives you it's important, because it gives you the idea of effectively how important these major trade routes were for international policy already at the time. So the Byzantines at this point have to cope with the Bulgarian invasion of their, let's say, closest province to Constantinople itself. So they hastily assemble a large army under the generals Procopius Cranitus and Curticius, which included the imperial guard that consisted of Khazar mercenaries. The Khazars were these semi-nomadic Turkic people with a confederation of Turkic-speaking tribes that, since the 6th century, had established a major commercial empire covering the southeastern section of modern European Russia. The Khazars created what, for its duration, was the most powerful polity to emerge from the breakup of the Western Turkic Khaganate that had formed the result of the beginning of the 7th century after the split of the Gokturk Khaganate into the Western Khaganate and the Eastern Turkic Khaganate. These were big powers that was power stretched along centuries. Hundreds of if not thousands, as a matter of fact, of miles. They had contacts with these broader Eurasian powers, even with Tang China, for example. So Khazaria had become the foremost trading empires of the medieval world, and commanding the western marches of the Silk Road and playing a key commercial role as a crossroad between China and the Middle East, and Kievan Rus, that at this point was also on the rise. And they were dominating roughly up between the mid of the 7th century and the end of the 10th century, the vast area extending from the Volga-Don steppes to the eastern Crimea and the northern Caucasus. And these people had been early in contact with Constantinople, for which had even formally converted, in part at least some of their leaders. It wasn't really a unitary direction, to Judaism, right? Actually, in the Khazar Empire was plenty also of Muslims and of Christians, not just Jews, but this was a move to grow kind of more acceptable at the eyes of the Byzantines, albeit maintaining kind of their own specificity, right? And the Khazar history is definitely extremely fascinating, but we don't have time to cover it for now. So there was a battle, excuse me, I was talking about the Khazars. The Khazars in fact sent these troops that formed part of the imperial guard of Constantinople itself, so you can understand how close the ties between the Khazars and Constantinople were at the time. So there's this ensuing battle between the Bulgars and Byzantines in the theme of Macedonia, that is modern eastern Thrace, roughly, probably close to Adrianople, into which the Byzantines are defeated and their commanders perished. Well, it was a pretty heavy blow because the Bulgarians demonstrated already that they could defeat substantial Byzantine force. Most of the Khazars were captured, and Simeon had their noses cut and sent them back to Constantinople as, basically as an humiliation that was typically done. Like, look at what we can do with your men, right? So this was a pretty tough slogan. So since the main Byzantine forces at this point were engaged in the east against the Arabs, Constantinople was momentarily left uncovered, and this was a pretty big threat to the same capital of the empire, posed by the Bulgarians. So Leo VI turned to the well-tried methods of Byzantine diplomacy and sent envoys with rich gifts to the Hungars. Right. So the Hungars were, this population at this point were settled in the along the Dnestr River, so they hadn't quite already they had arrived in Europe at the gates of Europe, let's say, but not still entered into Central Europe where they would settle. they therefore inhabited the steppes to the northeast of Bulgaria proper. They were bordering the Bulgarians. So when Simeon I refused, and these were, by the way, kind of similar peoples to the same what the Bulgars originally had been, right? So these were semi-nomadic populations, were pretty warlike, skilled in horsemanship, chiefly horse archery, and always seeking a new place to settle when the occasion arose, right? Always in search of fresher pastures and to build their own sphere of influence and of rule over the local population. So when Simeon I refused to conclude peace and imprisoned the Byzantine envoy Constantinakis at the end of 894, the Byzantine navy was used to ferry the Magyars across the Danube, right? Despite the fact that the Bulgarians had barred the river with chains and ropes. Simeon I at this point was at the Byzantine-Bulgarian border, facing the general Nicephorus Phocas, right? Nicephorus Phocas, often surnamed the Elder to distinguish him from his grandson, Emperor Nicephorus II Phocas. This kind of what was, however, still in his figure one of his most prominent Byzantine generals of the late 9th century. And the Phocas family was one of the most important aristocratic families of the empire, originally stemming from Cappadocia, and between the 9th and 10th century, they provided this astonishing series of high-ranking generals and emperors as well, like Nicephorus II being the most famous. Nicephorus Phocas was, in his youth, was taken into the personal retinue of the Emperor Basil I the Macedonian, rising quickly to the post of Protostrator and then governor of Carcianan, whence he fought with success against the Arabs, and around 886 he had led a major expedition in southern Italy, where his victories laid the foundation for the Byzantine resurgence in the peninsula. He was a very skilled military man, and after his return from the Italian campaign, he was raised to the post of domestic of the schools. It was the senior military post of the Byzantine Empire, and that had acquired greater importance. Originally they were just a senior, simply commander of the Scholai, that would be the elite military guard unit, and also the senior of the elite of the Tecmata regiments. The domestic quickly had risen in prominence, and by the mid-9th century its elders essentially occupied the position of commander-in-chief of the whole Byzantine army next to the emperor, right? So this gives you the measure of these figures, and in fact was the commander-in-chief of the Byzantine army, and he led with success against the Arabs in the east, and the Bulgarians of Tsar Simeon in the Balkans at this point, and it was actually to leave just for a little while. In fact, this also probably influenced largely the strategic development of the Boulgarophygon campaign. And so when the Hungars were called by the Byzantines to attack from the north, Simeon was confronting Nicephorus Phocas and had to abandon his post to march northwards pretty speedily to confront with the Hungars. So what happens is that somewhere in Dobruja, so this region, in historical region in Eastern Europe, at the mouth of the Danube, the Bulgarian army was defeated by the Hungars, right? Simeon himself had to flee to the strong fortress of Drastar in northeastern Bulgaria, and the Hungars looted and pillaged unopposed into Bulgaria, reaching the outskirts of the same capital, Preslav. After that, they basically they reconnected with. Actually, they connected. They arrived far south with Nicephorus, I believe, himself, with the Byzantine army in general, and they sold all the Bulgarian captives that they had taken during the raids to the Byzantines. And after this, the Hungars retreated to the north of the Danube. So having come, this was kind of normal. I mean, this tells you how how long the strategic range of these semi-nomadic armies was at the time, that they could make this pretty sudden and effective raids into deep raids into enemy territory. In this case, it had been possible because they had crushed the Bulgarian army on the field, and the Bulgarians couldn't really react. And it was normal in these conditions to simply enclose yourself in the gates and waiting for the storm to pass, right? So that you could at least hope to leave to fight another day. And there weren't any forces. So to meet this threat again now, or at least it was a sensible choice not to risk the ones that were left, because eventually they were left, and they were also, as we will see, to fight a Boulgarophygon. So at this point, there's a bit of diplomatic gaming here, because Simeon pretended that he wanted to negotiate and to put forward the issue of prisoner exchange, right? Since the Bulgarians had defeated the Byzantines, as we've seen before, and now the Magyars had defeated the Bulgarians and sold these captives to the Byzantines, there was this play of, okay, let's exchange prisoners and so on, to gain time, because at this point the Bulgarians had to react in a way or in another to the Magyars and to the Byzantines. So the Byzantines sent, in the meanwhile, Leo Koiros Factus in Preslav, who was a Byzantine official and had risen to high office under Emperor Basil the Macedonian, and served as an envoy under Emperor Leo, in fact. And he was sent to Bulgaria, eventually also to the Abbasid Caliphate. So in this context, he was being used as a diplomat, right? And in fact, he was sent in Preslav to negotiate the terms of this prisoner exchange. So Simeon was buying time at this point to address the hunger threat that was definitely looming, because the Hungar army was intact, and the Bulgarians couldn't really do much against the Byzantines while the Hungars were still around. So he deliberately prolonged the negotiations, and Koiros Factus was repeatedly refused an audience. In the meantime, Simeon allied with the Pechenegs. So clever move, as this Pechenegs, or Patsinaks, if you want to call it, was this semi-nomadic Turkic people, Central Asia, which had settled. It was settled now basically in the southern Ukraine, and that bordered with the Hungars in the east. And definitely the Hungars and the Pechenegs didn't quite like each other. The Pechenegs were also stronger. So the idea was obviously taking the Hungars catching them between two fires. And while Simeon was making this into this international deal, working for it, the Bulgarians appealed instead to his father Boris I, who had become a monk, to assume even the command of the Bulgarian army. So there was this new campaign into which the Hungars were defeated decisively, suffering a devastating defeat at the hands of the Bulgarians and the Pechenegs, I believe, at this point, or at least, I don't remember. Actually, the Pechenegs are mentioned, but eventually they at least were tying the hands of the Hungars a little bit, given that they were in their rear, that they could, this probably limited their strategical capabilities against the Bulgarians. And yet it was similarly a bloodbath for the same Bulgarians as a victory, because according to certain sources, they lost something like 20,000 cavalrymen. Naturally, this is kind of an exaggeration, but it still speaks for kind of a very heavy, losses, even for the victors, right? So naturally here, the fact that we're talking about cavalrymen is realistic, because as we said before, the Bulgarian army was mostly about cavalry, at least it had been traditionally. And naturally, with the settlement in Thrace, they could also count on this Slavic infantries that could be provided by the local communities. But their arm was still mostly cavalry that could also move in this pretty broad theaters into the Balkans. So it kind of makes sense. And yet the Bulgarians still had military manpower to use. So this tells you, as I was saying before, that the Bulgarians were pretty strong in their own regard. I mean, they had founded a solid power that could provide them, even with after 2 bloody battles, other troops to field. So it's considerable from a strategical point of view. The commander of the Bulgarian army had been Boris the First. It was basically the first victory in the battlefield that Boris ever achieved in his life. And as a result of this defeat, the Hungars basically had to move westwards, because they were pressed by the Pechenegs at one point that they couldn't oppose to them much more power. So evidently, if the Bulgarians had defeated the Hungars, suffering 20,000 losses, even if it's an exaggeration, it's still a pretty heavy cost. You can imagine how many losses the Hungars had suffered. So such losses were very important, because these peoples were not terribly numerous demographically speaking. So by being annihilated in battlefield, it meant that they couldn't field much more, right? So obviously we don't know practically and surely anything concrete about the real numbers of these people, but the fact that they were eventually obliged to move in a relatively far place, because they had to go through all the Danubian Valley, or at least the Carpathians. I really don't know which path they took. I think it was rather the Danubian route, kind of more sensible, but probably the migration also occurred into several chunks. It meant that on this eastern area of the today's north, kind of east of the Carpathians, they couldn't resist anymore to the pressure the Pechenegs, right? So they had necessarily to settle elsewhere, and in the middle of the Pannonian Plain, as we know. So this the strategical context of the Battle of Boulgarophygon eventually brought seemingly to this establishment of the same Kingdom of Hungary. Would have become properly the Kingdom of Hungary, right? Because they eventually, the Hungars settled in there, started launching raids into post-Carolingian Europe, and eventually they were defeated at the hands of the Germans, and they settled down. Definitely, they in this sense they just as the Bulgars had imitated the Byzantine Empire, the the Hungars imitated the Ottonian Empire, and therefore also these two peoples entered into different spheres of influence, as the Bulgarians remained Orthodox and the Hungarians eventually would become Catholics. So two different stories, but still into these close areas fundamentally. We're still bordering each other after this move to Hungary. So when Simeon came back to Preslav, proud of the victory, as the sources claim, he broke definitely the negotiations with Koiros Factus, and once again invaded Byzantine Thrace. Further encouraged by the death of the capable general Nicephorus Phocas, in fact, that had just died in 890, either 95 or 96, we don't really know. So at this point, the Byzantines were in a hurry once again. They transferred all the themes and tagmata of that is basically all the forces that were fighting at this point on the with the Arabs, right? The themes are the main military administrative divisions of the Middle Byzantine Empire. The tagmata is this military unit of a battalion or regiment size that formed the Byzantine Emperor, the elite regiments of the Byzantine Emperor Constantine V, and comprising the central army of the Byzantine Empire between the 8th and the 11th centuries. And therefore there is the switch of the even of the Asiatic teams to Europe to counter the Bulgarian threat. The army at this point was the Byzantine army was commanded by the domestic of the schools, Leo Katakalon, right? So the one that effectively fought at Boulgarophygon, and he was definitely less apt commander than what Phocas had been. So that's where we get to the Battle of Bulgarophygon, about which we know nothing else. If not, it was fought in the summer of 896, and that the Byzantines were thoroughly routed. And the Byzantine historian, a Byzantine historian, actually writes, the Romans were decisively defeated all down the line, and they all perished. So, among the casualties was also the Protovestarius Theodosius. It was important. He was basically second in command of the army. The Protovestarius was, an important official, right, of the in the high court position. And Leo Katakalon actually managed to escape with a few other survivors. So this was a pretty sound Bulgarian victory. And in fact, instead, the Byzantines had suffered such heavy losses that one of their soldiers retired from society and became an ascetic under the name of Luke the Stylite, right? As a very famous figure. He had served, in fact, as a soldier during the reign of Constantine Porphyrogenitus, the Byzantine emperor, and after during the Battle of Boulgarophygon, he witnessed the death of several thousands of people. So he believed at that point that God had preserved his life, and he became a monk, was later ordained as a presbyter, and he took up this ascetic and hermetic life as a Stylite. And after 3 years standing on a pillar, he went to Mount Olympus, and then to Constantinople, and finally to Chalcedon. And for 45 years he would live at the top of a pillar near the city in pursuit of the sanctity of Christ, and he is believed to have died around 970. And it's very interesting that this slaughter was the cause of his retirement from the world, right? This idea of having even lived this terrible experience. War naturally has always been a terribly violent business. You can imagine what also like in the I'm not saying that in the 9th century, it was kind of worse, but how impressive it could be also at the time, a slaughter of thousands of people, to which I wouldn't say today we are kind of used to, but it was a big thing, and also seeing it through your own eyes definitely changes you forever, like what happened with Luke, and it's just pretty understandable. So, gaining at this point the upper hand, Simeon I led the Bulgarian troops to Constantinople, burning villages en route. We don't actually know whether actually this happened after or before the battle. There is one Muslim historian, Al-Tabari, that was actually, he wrote in Arabic, but he was actually an Iranian scholar of the time that even wrote that Leo VI was so desperate after the battle and the consecutive refusals of peace from the side of the Bulgarians, that was forced to gather an army of Arab prisoners of war and sent them against the Bulgarians with the promise of freedom. This is actually an exaggeration. What probably Al-Tabari was referring to is the armament, the arming, let's say, of the Arabic settlers in Byzantine Europe. The Byzantines had settled many foreigners from Asia into Europe to repopulate certain areas and to form kind of permanent garrisons there, like militias, etc. So resorting to them was kind of a last, resort of definitely cheaper and mostly like militia-like units that were what seemingly the Byzantines now were completely, remained with, because the Bulgarians had wiped them out. The Imperial Guard with the Khazar mercenaries and now the all the various tagmata of the empire. So it's at least those who had been moved in there. The others also were needed to protect other regions. So the problem now was really serious. And the Bulgarians didn't push on. The Bulgarians stopped, evidently because they, after all, they couldn't take Constantinople, which is a historical constant. Like, the Byzantine army can be defeated at one point. They don't manage to stop the enemy threat, but in front of the Theodosian walls, this time, nobody really can do much. And definitely the Bulgarians, I think, at this point didn't have the means to besiege and to take Constantinople in the first place. So at this point, Simeon was clever, and he agreed to negotiate. And the war ended finally with a peace treaty, which formally lasted until around Leo VI's death in 912. And in this peace, Constantinople was obliged to pay an annual tribute to Bulgaria in exchange for the return of allegedly 120,000 captured Byzantine soldiers and civilians. This number is also exaggerated, but it definitely reflects the large numbers of the Byzantine captives and other both military and civilians, right? So, which is kind of realistic, meaning that, not number, but the fact that the Bulgarians had these prisoners of war, plus they had basically deported other, certain local civilians that had found in Byzantine territory during their devastations. So, and under this treaty, the Byzantines also ceded an area between the Black Sea and Strandzha, that is a mountain massif in southeastern Bulgaria and the European part of Turkey today. It is in the southern east part of the Balkans, between the plain of Thrace to the west and the lowlands near to the north, and the Black Sea to the east, right? It's an important area. In fact, it's very close to Constantinople, right? And so it's not really. It has its strategic importance. There were several. I remember like 30 castles in there. Or I should check maybe better. Yeah, and so this meant naturally more land that and more control of the Bulgarian side from the Bulgarian side on the European hinterland of the Byzantine Empire, right? And a looming an even greater looming threat on Constantinople itself. But the Bulgarians were conscious of this. They promised in turn not to invade Byzantine territory. Simeon I was content with his results and considered he had superiority over the Byzantine Empire. And despite the success, he realized that there was still a lot to do before prevailing over the empire for good. So that's, he knew where to stop. He needed his own political and ideological base, and consequently he launched an ambitious construction program in Preslav so that it could rival Constantinople. So it was more of a political, cultural move than a military one that could, in fact, lay the basis of a greater Bulgarian power. And in the meanwhile, Simeon I had also imposed his authority over the Serbians in return for recognizing Petar Gojniković as its ruler. So basically, Serbia had become a Bulgarian protectorate at this point. And it was important because it was reducing Byzantine influence over the Western Balkans as a result, right? So it wasn't much about literally controlling these peoples. Then naturally, after, it was important because there were probably tributes involved in, favorable policy. But the real point here is that, after this Byzantine defeats, naturally imperial power was contracted and now expanding against it, and kind of substituting to it in certain areas was the next sensible move. This story, however, taught Simeon that how vulnerable Bulgaria actually was from the northern tribes neighboring his empire, when especially influenced by Byzantine diplomacy, right? And there is the Danube, there is this area of marshlands in Dobruja, etc., where in fact they had met the Angers the first time, but it was still kind of open plain, and there were, once you defeated one people, there were, however, still others that were there next. So. However, this experience paid off, as in 917 Simeon managed to counter the Byzantine force to ally with the Serbs or the Pechenegs. That, as you see, the Pechenegs, they defeat the Angers, that were now their neighbors, because the Bulgarians asked them, but now, the Angers migrate and therefore they become neighbors to the Bulgarians themselves. So now they also have attrition with them. So and there is this important battle of Achelos that we can talk maybe on another occasion, that took place on August, in fact, the 20th of 917 on the Achelos river in eastern Bulgaria, near the Bulgarian Black Sea coast, close to the fortress Teuton, modern Promoria, between Bulgarian and Byzantine forces, where the Bulgarians obtained a decisive victory, which not only secured the previous successes of Simeon I, but also made him de facto ruler of the whole Balkan Peninsula, nominally, and excluding the well-protected Byzantine capital of Constantinople and the Peloponnese, right? And that was also one of the biggest disasters in Byzantine history. And it's very interesting to see at this point how vulnerable Byzantines also were on the Balkan side, right? So the rise of Bulgaria definitely posed a threat that was more than just, nominal. It was really a thorn on the side, very close to the heart of the empire. So it was a problem with which the Byzantines would have to deal with for more than one century before finally crushing the Bulgarians and resizing their influence that reemerged basically. But during the 12th century, but especially after the destruction of, let's say, the Byzantine Empire during the Fourth Crusade, where there is this a further re-expansion of the Bulgarian power, but on very different bases at that point. So this was the Battle of Boulgarophygon. That, as we have seen, it's like, but we know almost nothing about it. But this broader context, I think, was very productive to explain, because it really tells you a lot about what these populations were interacting like, and which kind of perspectives you can essentially approach. There's also the reference to the Hungars, that in 906, so just 10 years after Bulgarophygon, were at this point lords of the walled plain that stretches from Croatia to the Austrian Marches and Bohemia. So this other new power that had formed in that area, and that also created problem to Saint Simeon, that naturally lived this basically as a challenge, especially the Hungars were extending now part of their power over Transylvania and the Valley of Theiss, that were not a big deal for Simeon, save for the salt mines that was a great Bulgarian export. So no proud king can endure to lose vast provinces without striking a blow. But though we know that his troops fought the Hungars, of the extent of the fighting, we know practically nothing. So this is also another chapter that tells you how few we actually know about the early Middle Ages. The Hungars state that the Greeks, as they called the Byzantines, helped the Bulgarians, but that they were both defeated. So it's pretty vague, telling you the truth. This is from the Anonymous Historia Ducum Hungaria, right? So it's not much of a extremely reliable source for this at this temporal height, telling you the truth. But it's still interesting that there was this other element the northwest of the Balkans, that was also, eventually to evolve in what we know would have become the Kingdom of Hungary, and what basically the largest power in the area. It's likely that after a few unsuccessful skirmishes on this far frontier, like across the Danube, and this kind of tough ground, because the Carpathians are kind of a hell, as a ground, he gave up and basically cut his losses and evacuated the land. So the vast Trans-Danubian Empire of the Bulgarians, that had kind of stretched objectively across the Danube, was reduced to the plain of Wallachia at this point. So just south, basically between the Carpathians and the Danube, right? So that's a pretty interesting history, because you see that even this vast empires at the end of the day that had been created by semi-nomadic powers were all to readjust fundamentally on different internal bases that required more than this far kind of long-ranging strategic capabilities, rather to strengthen the local bases in the core of their powers. So this is very meaningful, because in the process there is all the sedentarization of these peoples, the mutuation of this of this imperial models from either Constantinople or Germany, and a path that necessarily leads to a territorialization, we can say, that is much narrower. If you look at the Bulgarian Empire, they had kind of they really had that big control over such vast areas, but some it was formally nominal, and it was also favored by the lack of other powers, like the fact, for example, that the others had been blown away by Charlemagne, and that this, also with the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, brought the Bulgarians, that were still consistently powerful, to stretch very far northwest. As soon as the Hungars arrive, there's a containment, and it couldn't be so, because it wasn't much about Hungar power proper. It was also about really the distances in here. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of kilometers into pretty tough territory, telling the truth, that is also completely like, I mean, you can imagine what the nets of communications were like in these areas that had never been, not even very lightly Romanized back in the day. I don't think that there was. It was very easy to control these territories. So it's really a shared difficulty that you find in various degrees, basically everywhere. And it's very meaningful that these powers eventually choose the option of having more contained powers from a geographical point of view, but kind of more robust, so able to withstand heavier blows at the end of the day. Okay, so for now, I'd say it's all. We could tell lots of other things, more telling the truth, but I'd stop it here. I'd do it another time. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.